Okay, good afternoon or good morning or good evening, depending where in the world you are. And thank you for joining our webinar, A Watchful Eye, Regulators Double Down on AI in Compliance. And I was thinking there's kind of a trick in the title there, right? Doubling down on AI and compliance. Or do we mean the compliance of AI, right? Or do we mean how AI can be used in compliance, right? And so we're going to talk about both today. We have a really great panel and we have a lot to cover. And I'm just going to pick from just whoever I see first on my Zoom to do some introductions and we'll dive in. So Alvin, I see you, then Shlomit. So Alvin, who are you?
Hey Alex, very nice to be here. Thanks for having me. So my name is Alvin Huang. I'm on the market development team for financial services here at AWS, with a focus across machine learning as well as generative AI. Prior to joining AWS, so I've been with AWS a little over 6 years. Prior to joining AWS, I spent 20 years within the financial services space, most recently at JP Morgan, where I was on their compliance surveillance team. So this topic here is near and dear to my heart. So again, very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Cool. Amazing. Shlomit?
So, hello everybody, nice to meet you. I'm Shlomit Labin. I'm the VP of Data Science at Shield, Financial Compliance. Have been in the AI industry for many years now, leading AI-driven solutions in many domains, and in the past few years in the financial compliance domain. So, we'll talk about that today.
Cool. Amazing. We're waiting on Lore Aguilar, who is a data scientist, who heads up, I think, a data science function within communication surveillance for Citi. Myself, I'm Alex de Lucena. I am Shield's Director of Product Strategy. Prior to that, I worked in compliance myself. I headed up a com surveillance function, and now I'm on the vendor side. So, I want to start off with sort of a thought to help kind of frame our conversation, right? And it's kind of a contradiction that sits at the heart of interest and adoption of AI in the compliance space. So, on the one hand, it's safe to say interest is elevated, right? And I think a lot of that extends from our consumer experience. AI is already such a part of our lives, whether it's suggesting what movies we watch, what music to listen to, clothes to buy. Teenagers use GPTs to do their homework and so on. Here's Laura. No worries on that. Laura, why don't you quickly tell us who you are, and then I was just kind of framing our convo, and we're going to kick things off. So, who are you, Laura?
Well, that's the eternal question, huh? Do we really know? Anyway, Lore
Keep it
Aguilar.
brief, please. Yeah,
So
Laura.
I am Director of Surveillance Design and Research within the Surveillance Intelligence Unit of Citi's ICRM surveillance. So I had a group of data scientists who look for ways to innovate, improve our surveillance design for markets, info barriers, and electronic communication surveillance.
Amazing. And I think so that rounds out our panel. And so just jumping into where I was. So I was talking just to help frame our conversation today about a contradiction that I think sits at the heart of adoption of AI in the compliance space. So we can all agree interest is elevated. Our consumer experience is already very embedded in the use of AI. And I think that kind of carries through, right? People are asking, how can we use these capabilities in a meaningful way to improve compliance? Right. At the same time, interest in compliance of AI is equally elevated, right? And they don't contradict each other, but there is some tension between the two because a lot of firms aren't sure how to vet these capabilities in order to adopt them. Some have MRM functions. We see regulators beginning to have to lead, whether it's the EU AI Act, recent FINRA Gen AI guidance, and that kind of thing, right? So we have these sort of two elements. And then there's something in the middle that I think gets talked about less, right? Which is how can AI actually help, right? So there's interest, there's compliance, but how can it actually help? What are good use cases? What's smoke? Because there's a lot of smoke. What's real? So in this webinar, we're going to look to cover all three, right? What can AI do? How do we vet it in such a way that it can be compliant? And what are the best use cases and best practices for adoption of AI? Let's start with present day. Let's baseline. Let's talk about where we're at. And so, Laura, we're going to start with you. Within your function, how are you using AI today?
Sure. Thanks, Alex. So I'm going to put in the context of communication surveillance, which is
Please,
really
'cause we know we could step back and it's been used for tens
right.
of years and all that kind of stuff. But within your communication surveillance, how are you specifically using AI?
Sure. I'm gonna start with like the broader definition of AI, not necessarily Gen AI. I mean, we have been using the traditional AI in terms of machine learning for our alert generation. So it's been useful in supplementing, complementing our, as folks here probably know, the workhorse of communication surveillance is lexicons and keywords and rules. So and as is probably as well known, the one limitation of that approach is kind of missing the context of a communication. And that's where potentially NLP and some of these more traditional supervised learning approaches can help in providing more context into what you're looking for. So that we're
Right.
actively using
Right. And if
for
I
alert
could just
generation. Yeah.
cut in really quickly, and for that traditional flavor, that classic AI, I think that typically means you're taking city comms, city sentences, and then you're looking to build a model, that focuses on a specific behavior from
Yes.
out of those sentences, right?
Yes.
And it's a very
Yes.
iterative process where you're kind of
Iterative.
saying this satisfies it, this doesn't, and then kind of looking to do it, right?
Right,
And
right, absolutely. And
right,
and and you can also use that in assisting for case disposition. If you have a historical corpus of what has been fruitful alerts, you can train on that to look
right.
for more of that. Now, so that is already in place, and there's already a model risk framework around that. Now, with this newer flavors of generative AI and the explosion of LLMs, I mean, the promise of that, where we're looking at that, is again in the alert generation, but the ability to significantly account for context and attention that even your traditional, say, LSTM approaches, some of these traditional supervised learning approaches just wouldn't be able to do, right? So that is big. The in the area of classification,
Mhm.
um, summarization. I think we might go into that a little
Yeah,
bit.
yeah. So we're gonna touch on use of
But
LLMs, classification, summarization. So that's all. But finish your thought.
high level, that's what we're currently exploring: classification, summarization, and then we're also looking to explore information extraction, topic
Mhm.
modeling. I mean, you can
Okay.
imagine if you're in the com surveillance space, those are key use cases.
Okay. Excellent. And I should say that if people want to ask questions, we have a lot to cover, but obviously, we'll try to answer some questions too at the end of the discussion. So, Alvin, over to you, right? I think what a lot of people know or know to different degrees is that AWS and other big tech companies are more and more sort of embedded within banks. And so what's happening is a lot of banks are sort of building these enterprise agreements with an AWS, and then AWS has a suite of tools that they can use, that banks can use to sort of experiment with and build their own solutions or that kind of thing. So just from your perspective, what kind of tools are people using, and what are some real world examples of how kind of we're, keep with that present day lens,
Yeah.
right? That kind of Lore walked us through, that you see firms using AWS kind of more broadly, but I think still as best we can within the kind of compliance space.
Absolutely. And maybe I'll take Lore's example and just expand on it a little bit, right? If you kind of take a look at that end-to-end surveillance process, right? Now this can be both trade surveillance as well as e-communication surveillance. The overall process is relatively the same, right? There's effectively kind of two subcomponents in there, right? You have the alert generation piece of it. So this is the identification of that suspicious activity, right? And then the second part is the alert investigation side, right? You research the alert and then you close it either as no action required or you escalate and potentially file a SAR. Now, to Lore's point, the use of AI and machine learning traditionally has been very focused on that first area, right, around the alert generation piece, right? So, for example, we see machine learning being used in anomaly detection for something like insider trading, or pattern recognition for something like spoofing and layering, right? Now, the key problem to solve here, right, it's really an optimization problem, right? You're trying to reduce the number of false positives that are generated while not missing any actual fraudulent activity. And machine learning is very, very good at solving that type of problem. Now, where it gets really interesting over the last year and a half, right, is the advancements we've seen in generative AI. So now we're seeing financial institutions leverage Gen AI to make that second part of that process, the alert investigation process, more efficient, right? So I'll give you a specific example here. One of the global exchanges has integrated Gen AI into their market surveillance technology platform so that instead of an analyst having to go through and manually search for and collect all of that necessary data that you need to disposition and alert, right? What this Gen AI application will actually do is automate and produce for you in a single pane of glass things like a consolidated table of the company's regulatory filings, right? News summaries, links to companies, sentiment analysis, and more, right? And they found that by reducing the manual effort involved, they actually saw a reduction of around 30% in the time it takes to close those alerts.
Okay, that's super interesting. I think, and let's just, and I want to start to explore like the potential more, but I think just to round things out, Shlomit, let's go over to you. Obviously, you and I both work for, comm surveillance archive and comm surveillance vendor, and sort of our businesses is to kind of try to add value to these to the use cases around regulatory compliance and that kind of thing, but also to think ahead, right? And to think how these tools can also be used to improve people's lives, to improve their compliance and that kind of thing. So why don't you talk about, what you've worked on to date? And I think nice transition, and people can jump in, and that kind of goes for the whole conversation, sort of jump in where you feel you need to. Let's start with present day, and then maybe let's start to lean into potential, and we can start talking about how we see where we see Gen AI going, and how we can kind of use that stuff. So over to you.
Sure, Alex. Maybe I will ignore your question and do a little bit of zooming out in the terms of looking at the development of AI technology in the past few years. Lore has described very well the challenges and the common practices of the compliance or comm surveillance. We're looking for detection, we're looking for maybe summarization will be added, topic analysis. These are the common challenges that everybody are dealing with today, and technology is constantly improving. Maybe pattern analysis, then machine learning, now maybe Gen AI, and we can do everything better, again, as Alvin was mentioning here. Next phase is, again, investigation. And for that, what we're trying to do is, I'm just repeating everything that was mentioned here, also in Shield, collect information on multiple amounts of data points and produce meaningful insights from it, multiple communications, reporting, all kinds of analysis to provide it automatically, look for things, suggestions for follow-ups, provide all of this for the compliance officer to pursue any kind of risk that may have been hinted. But maybe to take a step back and to talk really about the breakthrough in AI technology and in Gen AI, and what does it now offer that it didn't offer before. So we know that, again, the real breakthrough that started with the ChatGPT and all of the models that followed it was the real jump in human level reasoning, the ability to understand much deeper and a much more complicated issue. So even if we're looking at a simple detection task, the understanding of the full nuances that occur in a communication can be done by a single model instead of breaking it through to multiple detection tasks, placing it together. The second thing is that generative AI is now communicational, so we can actually theoretically talk to it or interact with it, and more importantly, perform multiple steps in our assignment with a kind of assist that follows us around, that remembers the steps that we did before, and also can integrate all of the information and all that was done so far with additional things in the neighborhood. I want to say one thing. The breakthrough in this technology has created first real, I think, impression on everybody. There's something very new that we can now use, and a new capability that we really need to adopt. But the second thing was, and that's to your question, Alex, how can we adopt it usefully? And you know, there are all kinds of trials in this domain. Summarization is a good example. This is something that these engines are doing well. Is this the full benefit that we can do from these models? It's probably the first steps, and we can leverage them for much more advanced challenges.
Right. But let me stop you real quickly, just so we can kind of take a gradual approach and maybe talk about summarization a little bit first, because I think Laura raised it as well. So I think, so one thing that's been interesting to me about reading some of the positions or that regulators have put out so far is that they're really doing their homework, right? So if we see in the EU AI Act and we see in the recent FINRA guidance, we see that with the FINRA guidance, for example, they've taken this position on the one hand where they're sort of saying the controls you have are good enough, right? Keep going, right? And they list all these examples of how AI could be used to improve compliance. And within the space of compliance surveillance specifically, they list detection, right, which we started to talk about a little bit, and they list summarization. Now, they're not saying run into it, but they're saying these are examples where we see it being used. And we'll get into the controls later in the conversation, but basically the controls you have are good enough, you know, to sort of extrapolate the information you need to be comfortable with it, right? So let's assume that summarization is something that people could lean into today, and let's think about how it could be used in a meaningful way, and then also, you know, because you were just starting to go down that lane, how it might just be the first pass. And maybe there are limits to it. And obviously, Laura jump in, Alvin jump in, you know, that kind of thing.
Maybe I'll start, and Laura, you can add, because you're also experimenting with this. I think that the challenge in summarization is you can provide, summary is something fluff. It's not a yes/no answer. You can provide multiple summaries of the same conversation. Some will be more useful, some will be less useful. You know, the common answer that we give in the case of a compliance officer, summarization of a conversation can be lacking the specific risk that occurred in the communication, because it's not the gist or the essence of the overall talk between two people or four people in the communication. So the question is, how do you direct the summarization to actually be beneficial for you and for your specific needs? So we now have this great technology that is very good in creating summaries, but it needs to be directed to answer your specific needs, which in our case, I think all three of us, is to find financial risk or to detect a financial risk in a communication, either by ongoing alerts or by investigation. So it's not, you can ask ChatGPT, here's a communication, please summarize it for me. It will give you an answer. The technology is there. But in order to make it useful for the specific use case, you need to do more manipulation on it, to feed it with more information, to make sure that you have more controls in place, so it will actually serve your needs and not just produce a nice summary.
I think that's a really key point in terms of what we're using. I mean, one clear use case is, let's say you have one again, an alert, the communications alert, and it could go on for, you know, multiple exchanges in a chat. That could be a and it will be a mix of certain things. Some will be talking a little bit more business, something you're interested in, and then just like that, they're going to delve into something more casual, right? So how is, if we're able to maybe prompt it in the right way, so to summarize it in the right way and kind of like what we're looking for, that's gonna assist the surveillance analysts who are looking at this. Because remember, again, I want to put it in the context of what folks are used to and where we're moving. with the lexicon approach in surveillance, you know exactly why it flagged, right? Because the words are there. Here,
Right.
it's more of what's the context, right? What did it find, right? Perhaps in that summarization, there's be a little bit more explainability or reasoning, or into at least what you should initially look for, and that will help in the investigation process.
Right. I think one thing that people need to ask themselves with summarization is how it's adding value, right? Is it adding more work, right? Because now you have two steps, right? Or is it creating less work, right? Because ideally that's what it should do. And I think we're not at a place yet. Not that we're not at a place yet. I think it's really just how we vet these capabilities and the specific use cases they're funneled through, right? As we decide them, right? Because you might have two sets of data side by side that you now have to review both together, or you may have a piece of data that provides better at a glance insight that allows you to sort of make a quicker decision, right? Which is the ideal, right? I think another thing I've seen, and this one's a little harder to vet, right, is how do you vet? Because let's just say that because there is just so much out there, how do you vet that something actually works for you, right? Could you just plug this into ChatGPT yourself and ask it a piece of trade jargon or something like that, and it'll tell it back to you? Or is this something, that whatever capability you're being sold or experimenting on, you can meaningfully add value to? Right. And I think, Laura, you have a privilege there, right? Which is that you're already living deeply inside your use cases, right? But I think, Alvin, just to kind of spread it around, like since your view is more generalized, how do you help firms kind of zero in on, we're talking about summarization, but like as you see fit, like how do they kind of make the decision they need, right? How do they sort of vet these use cases in a meaningful way so they can use these tools?
Yeah, I mean, so largely where we see customers leveraging something like generative AI, right, are more around the internal facing use cases, right? So again, it's almost like the Iron Man analogy, right? The Gen AI is the suit, right? And you're making the person better, right? So if you need to get information, the Gen AI can grab that information, it can summarize it, it can collate it for you, right? So you don't have to go to 3 different data sources to get that information together, right? If you need to say summarize, say a news story or maybe an earnings transcript, right? It might be 80 pages of earnings transcript, and you want to summarize down to 3 paragraphs, right? It's very like to Shlomi's point, it's very very good at doing things like that, right? And we've seen that it's added value, right? The example I gave before with a exchange that's doing this today, right? It is reducing the time it takes to evaluate and resolve those alerts, right, by 30%. If we kind of venture outside of surveillance, right, things like within investment banking, right, like summarizing historical research, things like that, generating new ideas, absolutely, right. You see kind of that summarization being done. Now, kind of to your point, Alex, is how trustworthy is it, right? Can you trust that summarization? And I think we'll touch on this later, right? But there's certain techniques there now, right, that have been developed, which really links kind of the output generated by the Gen AI, right, back to the original sources, right? So you have kind of trust within that system.
Cool. Amazing. And then I think, Laura, you had started to talk earlier about LLM classifiers, right? And how you see those potentially changing the space and how you detect and that kind of thing. So we've talked about summarization being one use case. How do you see sort of the use of LLMs as classifiers or even more broadly changing the work you'll be doing in the next year or two?
Yeah. I mean, when we're building surveillance scenarios, we're really putting pieces together, and you can have classifiers that detect certain indications of behavior. Give you an example: secrecy. So how would you kind of detect a note of secrecy in the text? I mean, there are the traditional machine learning is you feed it. There's some examples, right? But maybe the promise of this as a classifier is, is it able to detect that better, right? Detect the nuances in the tone in the conversation better, right? And we'll see once we actually try the classifier. Nice thing is we have a number of examples in ground truth. to compare this with. Plus, you also have a challenger model in your existing ML already. Another one is topic modeling. So again in the realm of surveillance, the very simple question of, is this trade talk that's going on, or is this more casual conversation, right? Is this deal talk? Or what other topics are being clustered around in this conversation? That again, I mean, we have techniques that try to do that, but I think the exciting thing is we think that LLMs, because of the corpus they're trained on, is potentially going to be better able to do this. But one thing I'd note in both summarization and all of these use cases, um, including classification, I mean, just be mindful of, at the same time that we're looking for LLMs to be able to tie the story in a chain of conversation, we also have to take to look at whether the accuracy. I think, Alvin, you alluded to that. The accuracy, how does it relate to the length of the input text? Right? Is it, the longer the thing, is there some degradation in the accuracy the longer you give it? Right. But that's just one consideration that I think folks should be mindful of.
So let me pause you right there, because I think that's a good way for us to kind of start talking about controls, governance, and how some of this stuff can be compliant, right? So I think just a quick thought to phrase that is we have two parallel functions, right? So a lot of firms have, and in a sense, they're both compliance functions, right? So we have the model risk management function, which doesn't sit in compliance necessarily, but is used to vet models across a firm, right? And certainly, Lore, you'll have been through that process of getting your models through those teams, and for them to sort of go through the criteria they need to feel that they can be comfortable with what that model is meant to do, right? And the outputs it gives, and that kind of thing, right?
Right.
And then we also have the question of compliance, which is just like, how do compliance teams become comfortable with just the idea of AI? And within some banks, we see they now have AI policies and that kind of thing. You would think that these would be sort of parallel in a sense, because they have similar goals. But what we're seeing is on the one hand, the MRM functions are quite mature, but haven't quite adjusted to how they conceive of how they should vet LLMs, right? In part because of the supervisory model, people like yourself, Laura, have given them, right, where they've sort of come to understand, like, okay, well, if it comes from this data set, then I get it, right? And I can kind of follow through how you came up with these answers, right? So back to you, Laura, and then, we can all jump in. Like, what has been the hesitation internally, right, around leaning in more to the use of LLMs and that kind of thing? Or maybe it isn't, and there isn't one, and there's a gradual approach. But what would be some of the considerations for you internally as you look to kind of lean into this new world?
Absolutely. I would say it's not so much hesitation as caution, as reasonable caution. There are no risks in generative AI, hallucination, privacy, potential fairness and bias on the data it was trained on, especially if you're not on the corpus it was trained on. Data limitations. It's trained as of this particular date, right? So the accuracy is conditioned on that. That have to be navigated. But I would say there's general openness to adoption of this, and the MRM piece really has to take a look not just at your the traditional things you've been looking at, soundness, again, potential bias, but these other considerations, hallucination is a big one, because transparency and explainability is another one. We know how to do that for the more traditional ones. I mean, how do you do that for
wouldn't that be less true for a classifier that you've sort of taken a big, Gen AI engine and then kind of like focused it on something in particular? Like, wouldn't things like hallucinations and whatnot be less of a concern?
But potentially, I mean, hopefully, but these are things you have to test, right? When you say, is this thing a small talk? You really need to be able to validate it, to look at the accuracy of the output, to be smart about how you assess that testing. segmenting your data across different categories, make sure that there's kind of consistency in the way it's predicting it. But there are all of these, I think, considerations that you would have to do. But again, we're not starting from scratch. There's a whole experience that we can draw from in how we do these things.
Got it. I want to just open it up. Does anyone want to comment? Shlomit, Alvin?
Maybe again, the new technology puts in front of us new challenges, and even old challenges needs to be addressed differently. So when you're talking about how do we evaluate accuracy, there's one part of it. Okay, so how do I evaluate accuracy, but also how do I influence the accuracy? Eventually, in classical machine learning, you can retrain a model. Usually in generative AI, big models that are currently released, the way to influence the model is less direct. And the way to validate the results is different. And we need to get used to those systems. You can ask ChatGPT, and it might produce, in a summary, let's take the summary use case, something that is completely relevant to the communication that happened there. How do you validate it? You cannot just retrain the model or influence it directly. You need to put in place all kinds of guards and controls. Ask it multiple questions. Use multiple agents, like multiple ways of framing the question to the model. Validate it against external data sources. I'll give you a small example of, let's say that I give a large Gen AI model communication and ask it to find, I curate the question well, and I ask it to find the financial risk in it, and it answers me. Now I need to reassure myself that the answer is correct. It is a huge model with a lot of knowledge. 99% of the time it is correct, but it also sometimes even invents things that weren't our concern in the past at all. I need to find metrics for that, and those metrics are currently being developed. So we can use different actors to ask the model. We can ask it in a more severe manner. Please make sure that you're guarded, that you're cautious in your answer. We can ask multiple models. We need to use multiple layers of technologies in order to validate the question. And we can also confront it with additional information from outside. For example, if I get an answer, there is insider information here, maybe I put in front of it the definition of insider information and validate, are you sure that this is matching your original answer?
Right.
Advanced Gen AI models are very good in doing what we call chain of thoughts, meaning rethinking their entire decision process and being able to reproduce an answer. And there are multiple advanced techniques in the data science world on how to operate this correctly. These are the kinds of controls that you need to put in place today in these kinds of technology.
Right. And
so
you say you, or you putting the onus on the vendor, the onus on the firm, or like who's putting these controls in?
First of all, when every vendor releases a product like that, it's on their responsibility as well. Of course, you need to make sure that you put in place all of these controls. You cannot offer a product that will create hallucination for the customer. In turns, it is eventually our customers are big financial organizations, and they're the ones that are exposed to regulations. So they need to make sure that they have in place all relevant documentations, metrics, evaluations, testings, ongoing monitoring, that they can show the eventually the regulator that these models are up to their needs. Maybe one more thing to say about concerns that currently raise. It's not only around hallucination and accuracy of the models, again, which are more difficult to measure. It's also, and we see it in regulations, FINRA started talking about it. The new AI Act that is coming in the upcoming 2 years is also discussing it. The fact that we have a far more robust technology, including all trends of regulations in all around the world, is scaring everybody. And the scare is, where will it meet me? How much more danger can it put me in? I have more robust machines, more robust technologies. I need to put more guards in place. And additional concerns, not only explainability and accuracy are in place. We see that now, for example, in the new AI Act, risk of AI is being measured not only by the robustness of the model, how large is your model, but also on the use case. What are you trying to do? Will it affect human workplace? Will it affect their privacy?
Right.
All of these things, and
that's why I think we've seen things like profiles come into questions too, right? So I think a question we fielded for a long time is, can we develop a risk profile? How do we know the LIBOR before the LIBOR and that kind of thing, right? And the EU AI Act specifically calls out risk profiles, right? And they're still refining that regulation is still being refined, right? But there are some use cases that may be harder to get across because of regulation and some that aren't. Now, I think a few of the things you addressed, you talked about sort of building prompts into LLMs as a way to refine them, right? I think validation criteria people use. I think, Alvin, you and I, when we were talking before this, where you were talking about other controls people can put into their models as well. So do you want to talk about some of those RAG controls and other things we discussed?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was gonna say maybe the approach I'll provide is gonna be something that's a little less technical and maybe even a little less rigorous, but it's kind of a good mental model to think about, right? Before I kind of jump down there, just for those on the call who aren't aware of hallucinations basically is when the large language model just makes something up, right? If it doesn't know the answer, it'll make something up. And for obvious reasons, that's a big concern within financial services industry, right, from kind of a compliance and regulatory perspective. Now, there's a couple of different ways to address it. The analogy I've heard, which is a good one, right, is treat that LLM as a person, right? And what do I mean by that? So if you treat that LLM as a person, there's a couple of steps you can take. Number one, just let the LLM know that the answer I don't know is an acceptable answer, right? So if you just simply just tell the LLM, say, hey, look, if you don't know the answer, just say, I don't know, instead of making something up, right? So that's number one. Number two is this RAG approach that Alex talked about, right? So RAG stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation. And basically what RAG is, it's an open book test for the large language model, right? You provide a data source, you provide a data repository for the large language model to reach into to find the answer to your question, right? Now, one of the customers has done this, right, where they put kind of their trading rule book, right, and hooked it up to an LLM so that their traders can ask questions to say things like, hey, what are cube orders, or what's the regulation around X, Y, and Z, right? And then what that large language model will do is it'll actually just reach back into that data repository and then bring back the answer for that trader, right? Now, there's kind of a couple of benefits here. Number one is that updating that data repository is a very, very light lift, right? For example, if there's a new order type that comes out or if a regulation changes, great, upload the most recent document, right? And now the large language model has access to the most recent information and can provide you the most up-to-date, most accurate information. You don't have to retrain the model or anything like that, right? The second benefit is the lineage, right? Which means that when the large language model gives you an answer, right? And just like as a person, right, when you ask a person a question and they give you an answer, if you don't like the answer they gave you, you ask them. You say, hey, where did you get this information from, right? And that associate, that colleague of yours is going to go back to say, well, I got the answer from this document, right? You should expect the same from your large language model, right? To say, hey, if the large language model gives me an answer, I don't really believe it, or I have some questions around it. Hey, where'd you get that answer from, right? And using this RAG architecture, it can do that, right? It can point you to say, hey, I got the answer from this document. And then kind of to Shlomi mentioned this, right, is it also then provides you that chain of thought or that step-by-step process in terms of how that large language model took that information, synthesized it, and how it arrived at its conclusion, right? So again, I think mental model-wise, treat that large language model as a human, right? So if you don't believe the answer, ask it to tell you where it got the information from, right, and how it did its thinking in terms of how it arrived at the conclusion.
Right. And I think the interesting thing we're all kind of harping on, right, is a change in mindset where we're going to a world in which the efficacy of these models, the efficiencies we understand, right, but the efficacy of them is being measured by their outputs, right? There are things about their lineage, right, the data sets they were trained on and whatnot that are much harder to understand. So in Lore's world, not that long ago, he could say, these are the, 20,000 emails I used to train this particular model, and these were the sentences, and someone could hold them. And I think it makes, intuitive sense that you can hold something and look at it and feel like you understand, like, well, that's how it became this, right? And I think the leap that's hard for people is, well, if I don't know, where it came from, how can I be comfortable with what it's telling me? And I guess what we're all seeing in our different ways is that there are ways to measure that, and there are controls you can put in place. And so that the validation people need to do now to become comfortable with the tools that they're, whatever it is they want to take on or try or experiment with or ultimately deploy, they need controls in place to be able to measure those outputs at various levels. The lineage of the information, what prompts are baked into it as a way to validate those answers, and then ultimately the actual merits of what comes out on the other end. Does it actually meet what it was asked to do? Right?
Right.
Does that feel right? I think one interesting thing, go ahead, Laura.
No, just to add, I really liked Alvin's analogy of them treated like a human. I had a question about that. I was thinking about this the other day. Again, in your you know, more traditional ML, machine learning, you have scores, right? You have likelihoods. How close is it to what you trained it on? So in base of that, you can say, okay, I'm gonna alert on the highest scoring ones. I think, folks are familiar with that use case. That's like a measure of the confidence of the prediction. If you ask that LLM as a person, how confident are you in your answer? Do we have a metric for that? I don't know, Shlomit, if you have that.
Yeah, so I don't know if confidence, eventually, I think that the first thing that was discovered about ChatGPT and the jokes and the, youth networks were all around, that ChatGPT will tell you everything, ChatGPT and all Gen AI models after that, with great confidence. It is sure of its answer. I think that the new advancements that were done in the past year is, again, through the chain of thought process, its ability to reflect and to think back, given additional information, or given that you are presenting it, the question, with different aspects, different angles, or presenting it with new information. As Alvin is saying, okay, go verify it for me. I can ask it, where did you retrieve the document from to start with, but I can also ask it, go look inside the regulations now and make sure that you made the right decision according to the definition there, not only according to your own knowledge. So there are a lot of techniques that allows us to increase our confidence in the result. I don't know if it is exactly the same as receiving a confidence score from the model itself. It's just making it answer it again, asking it in a different question, producing an agent that is a critic to it, adding additional agents that force it to look in additional information,
Right.
etc., etc.
Right. And I think I would add one other element, which is a really basic one, right? Which is just QA, right? I think, and I think taking yourself on that journey, I think people also think of this journey as kind of binary. You're switching, you're hitting a switch, and now everything looks like this all of a sudden, right? But I think firms should, they should walk there, right? Because you're going to get there, right? If you've pointed yourself in that direction, I think. Laura, one thing interesting you said when we were kind of talking in advance of this discussion is like, these are ultimately all risk-based decisions, right?
Yes.
So if you take a lexicon, right, I may look for the word rumor, and I know that I miss every time rumor was misspelled, or maybe I spelled it in an American way and not a European way. I'm missing a lot,
Yes.
but I know what I'm getting, right? And so that's why I can go to sleep, because that's it, right? And I can add words and that kind of thing. It makes sense, right?
Right.
Then you take the supervised model, right? There we'd have a threshold, and I would look through those results, right? And there were always a few sentences below the threshold that were kind of like, well, that kind of looks like what I want it to be, but it's sort of, it's clumped in with so much other stuff that I don't want to alert on, that the risk-based decision I'm making is to look at everything above this threshold, right? We're not asking people to make any different decision. At the end of the day, how are you comfortable monitoring for what you think you may have missed? And how confident are you, or how comfortable are you around the controls you have to validate what you want to find, right? And it's really just making the switch to how we develop those controls, I think. And at this point, we've listed a bunch, right? From, prompts to RAG. And I'm just saying basic QA, right? Across what you're not sure, whatever corpus you're not sure of, as a way to get comfortable. We're going to segue into best practices, how people vet this kind of stuff and that kind of thing. But before we do that, we do have a question, and I wanted to just kind of attach that. So it's sort of, in your view, your collective view, whoever wants to, what are the advantages of using ChatGPT versus Copilot 365 in day-to-day compliance operations? We have the option to use both, but it appears that the majority of team members are struggling with use cases. If you could provide some specific examples, it would be greatly appreciated. So let's start off. Let's help this caller out, and just I think of some more day-to-day uses of GPTs. But I think talking about use cases will help us kind of segue into the conversation I want to have just around use cases and AI more generally. So any thoughts on what are some good use cases for Copilot or ChatGPT?
I'm happy to start, Alex. And I kind of gave two, right? One was around like if you just want a simple kind of Q&A chatbot versus against kind of rules and regulations, right? So you can kind of dump all the rules and regulations, especially if you're a global bank, like where Lore's working, right? You probably interact with hundreds of regulators, right? All with different rules across the regions, right? And you may have a question around, hey, what's the trading rule in Zimbabwe, right? So if you kind of just dump all of that into a data store, right? Hook up an LLM, right? You can create a Q&A chatbot to get answers, right? In natural language, right? Across that. Now, I am hand waving a little bit. It's not quite that easy, and there's a lot of complexity behind how you set up a data store and the embeddings model, et cetera, right? But high level, right? That's kind of one use case you can use, in terms of generative AI, right? The other is around alert disposition, right? Or alert resolution, right? So again, if you have an alert that gets generated today for a front running alert, right? Or an insider trading alert, you need to collect data from multiple different sources, right? You may have to look up the company's filings, you may have to look up old investigations, et cetera, right? You can leverage that Gen AI to, again, grab all that data for you, summarize it, right? And then it reduces kind of that manual effort you need to do that.
Now,
and these are two. And
well,
sorry, just one last thought. These are two use cases, right, that are actually in production, right, by financial institutions today. So I'm not making these up. These are real production use cases.
The only other thing I'd add there is for coding assistance, right, which can help really in the development platform and time to market. I mean that can collaborative coding as with the use of a Copilot. I mean that is a known use case, and that is known to be productive.
Right. Now, if I could summarize, pun intended.
Maybe I can add one note.
Yeah, please.
In general, I think that all organizations should have already a connection to ChatGPT or Copilot, or both of them. It's just a matter of convenience. What's security-wise, and ChatGPT is now OpenAI allowing connection to ChatGPT as well. But I think that the main difference and the main advances that will be in this industry today is that when you have a connection to such a large model, it all depends on the fact that you have a question and you want to have a direct answer on it. Then it is great to direct this question to the model, and it will give you great answers. It's like it used to be looking in Google, now we're asking ChatGPT. But the future is to have platforms or products that do not require you to think of the question or to initiate the understanding that there is something missing here. But the platform itself will already, and I think that we touched upon it a little bit before here, the platform itself will already initiate and collect information for you and put it in front of you, collect risks for you, and make decisions for you even before you know that you have a question raising. So when you already know that you have data missing or a question that you need to answer, or you don't really know how to implement something in code, great, ChatGPT is the way to go. But in terms of incorporating it in products, there is also an additional leap that needs to be done. And how is the product leveraging it without the need of you actually initiating the question, but just putting it in front of your eyes.
But I think
the same way as alerting is being done today.
For sure. But I think like so we could segue, I think, into best practices and use cases. I think the point you made, Alvin, around regulations, right? I think to answer the question, I think if they can narrow the focus of what they, of the corpus they want to ask across for specific use cases, instead of saying, look across the whole bank, right? Load all your regulations in and see what performs best, right? Load all your policies in and see who gives, what gives you the policy you answer out of those questions, right? And then looking ahead, some of Shlomit's considerations, okay, of how this can be, refined and improved from here, right? The place we're at now is one where for the GPTs in day-to-day use, people are the point is to ask it questions is kind of where we're at. And where we're looking to get is where these machines can start to do more reasoning and help us get better insights across that kind of thing. Now, speaking of use cases, right, I think it's useful to sort of talk about this first, because I think we tend to think of the whole first, right? We tend to think of, from a surveillance perspective, right? It's again, show me LIBOR, show me whatever, show me something, and often show me something that's already happened, right? Or help me see the future, right? And it's not a useful approach to this technology, right? Because it's just too muddled, right? A way to get to that answer, right? So I think let's talk about how we focus our use cases in a meaningful way so people can start to leverage, think about, and experiment with AI. And sort of open forum, who wants to kind of pick it up?
I can probably start here as well, right? I think, look, the considerations going in, I think take your usual approach around use case, which is to have a well-defined use case or well-defined problem that you're looking to solve, right? And then seeing which technology helps solve that, right? Like, again, don't use Gen AI as a hammer, right? And everything will look like a nail, right? But sometimes traditional machine learning will help solve that. Sometimes basic analytics will help solve it. Sometimes you need generative AI, right? But I think the biggest shift that I've seen over the last, say, 12 to 18 months, right, is 18 months ago, people want to boil the ocean, right? People kind of say, hey, generative AI, it's a it's a model that can do multiple things, right? And we can solve all of these different problems. Now what we're seeing is people are more focused around the return on investment, right? To say, okay, if I'm going to apply Gen AI to this use case, what's my ROI on it, right? And I think that's the right approach to take. All the examples I gave, right, have a well-defined ROI, right? It's saving people X number of time, right? It's reducing the manual effort by 30%, right? Call center use case is another one, right? If you're able to reduce the call center time from 12 minutes down to 4 minutes, right? You know exactly how much money you've saved, right? And you know exactly how much that return on investment is going to be.
Right. And I think return on investment also means, like, I think people don't fully appreciate how much it costs to crunch all this data, right, through one of these machines, right? So we have this consumer experience of just asking questions, we get an answer. It sort of feels like, hey, that was easy. But to do some of these things at scale across all of a bank's comms or what have you is really expensive. So unless the output merits that money, it's really hard to justify taking that big a leap, right?
And
Go ahead.
That's a great point, Alex. So how do you take that? So what's the implication of that? We have a bunch of use cases. Every function in a large organization, a large bank will can't wait to get their hands on and experiment on this. But what we found useful is, do we have like a governing body, like a process, centralized process that knows all of these potential use cases, evaluates them consistently, uh, kind of assesses them through different dimensions, and really asks to prove out, okay, which ones from both a risk perspective, a um, uh, um, a productivity perspective, a potential success perspective, which ones of these do we start with, right? So that you have a systematic and transparent process for governing and proceeding along your Gen AI journey. I think that's useful. I mean, we have a center of excellence, for example, that even before Gen AI has principles for ethical use of AI. If you have that and you apply that through that same lens of human centricity, fairness, privacy, evolvability, because in my team, I certainly don't want to be restricted to the knowledge of of surveillance. I mean, there are other folks who've been using this in other domains that can potentially inform the way I use it. So if you have that like enterprise-wide body of knowledge and governance, I think that really helps.
Can I ask you, does that ever hobble experimentation though? Like in as much as, so much of this stuff is new, you might want to just figure out what it can and can't do, but you have to funnel it through like a specific use case in order to what's that dance like?
The spirit of the data scientist is just to jump into it,
Right.
but the risks are it's reasonable to be aware of the risks and to address them, and as long as it's communicated. So to answer your question, it hasn't. Of course, it could have been faster if you didn't have that, but there's a cost to not having appropriate governance. I mean, regulation is existing and forthcoming. You want to make sure that there's genuine cost of these things if you're not um, um prudent in your adoption.
Right. Shlomit, did you have something? I saw you kind of nod in there. Did you have something to add there?
So I think that in terms of the evolvement of the use of Gen AI, first, again, there was everybody were amazed by its capabilities, and then came fear, and regulations started to acknowledge the fact that it is going to be here and how to handle it. And it is true that now the value is the focus. How do I get real value from this Gen AI? And again, the first use cases are trivial in terms of let's ask it, let's have it summarized, let's have it give me answers. But the more challenging ones will be, how will it make decisions for me? How will it do the work behind the scenes for me? This is where the real value will come in place, not only in terms of doing better what we are doing so far, but also in terms of looking at the problem from a different perspective. I heard you, Alex, once suggesting instead of looking at alerts, for example, in the communication surveillance, let's look at risks. Now we know that we can collapse the information across alerts. Why are we looking at communication by communication? Why can't we look at it from a different perspective? This is the change of the world that will occur in terms of the new technology. But the correct judgment of it eventually will be, how much value does it give me?
Right. Alvin, over to you, and then I'll just add a few last thoughts.
Nothing more to add to what Shlomi and Lore said. So
okay, great.
go ahead,
Well,
Alex.
Your contribution has been great, so all good. So I think, look, if we've covered a few things today, I think we've looked to refine the value, right? So that people are thinking more squarely through what the value is, right? Everyone understands that these capabilities are there, but what's the actual value? I think we've also looked to emphasize that the controls exist and are continuing to mature around how we measure that value. And I think firms need to lean into, and vendors, right, need to lean into establishing what those controls are, showing them around, and iterating on them in a way that people can become comfortable using these tools. And then finally, on the other side, sort of as firms look to bring those on or think about them, what are the best use cases to do it with, right? And I think educating themselves, working in partnership, with whoever has these capabilities, and ultimately not being afraid to experiment, right? As long as they can be, they can document kind of what it is they did. Anyways, I feel like we could go on and on and on, but I'm really grateful for this panel. I'm really grateful for this discussion. We covered a ton. So for everyone listening, thank you for listening, and have an amazing day.